Welcome back, everybody. As you can tell, there is a new balance patch for epicseven, and with it there are 15 characters that have been buffed or adjusted, which is huge. I won't take any further or any amount of time extra stalling. This is a pretty big patch, and honestly 15 characters, 13 of which are 5 stars, is pretty huge. Without further ado though, let's break it down. So the first character we have to talk about is Specimen Says. Now, Specimen Says admittedly is kind of good at exactly what you'd imagine Specimen Says is good at. If you pair him with the stunner, he can one-shot something, and he does it pretty hard. However, although you may have believed or you may have thought that they would have made Specimen Says a bit, I guess, more evasive or add towards his survivability, the change that they've actually given to him is quite interesting. What they've decided to do, instead of affect his evasive or his more his defensive, I guess, mechanics or features, they've instead decided to give him I guess a bit more self-sufficiency with the increased attack buff when he uses his S2, which is fine. However, in addition to this, they also increase the chance for him to stun, which effectively brings some strength into his skill 2 and doesn't make it feel like something super useless and not worth using whatsoever. Now, to add to this, they've also added the effectiveness or an effectiveness increase, so that these abilities can actually land, and that's of course in terms of his skill 1 and his skill 2. However, in terms of his skill 3, they've also added the ability for you to lifesteal off of these abilities as well, which of course, or rather for the skill 3 specifically, which is huge, as most of the time if you're using the skill 3, you're using it to kill, and if you're killing or if you're going to be hitting a stun target with Sez's S3, that's basically a kill, and you're probably going to heal yourself all the way back up. Now, this change honestly from Sez, kind of okay, not insane, but again, the self-sufficiency, the attack increase, I think is pretty worthwhile, or well, worthwhile, I should say, is good for him and appreciated. However, not the most insane change that we could have seen, though of course having attack increase does mean, I guess in theory, you wouldn't have to take him alongside a Mediator Cowrick or an attack buffer or need to use Moonlight Dreamblade. Now, the next character we should talk about is Sage Wallen. I think this is one of the clear winners of the patch, honestly. Now, of course, whether or not you're actually going to be able to use Sage Wallen, it is kind of debatable. Currently, right now, there's a bit of a struggle in terms of determining whether or not the Zeos of the world or the openers of the world would even get affected by a Sage Wallen, as in most cases you have someone that pushes back, that slows, that one-shots you, that enables another character to instantly one-shot the Sage Wallen. Sometimes Zeo has more effectiveness than the Cezanne. There's a whole game of cat and mouse here that is honestly kind of annoying when it comes to dealing with Sage Wallen, which makes him a bit more unpopular as of late, especially compared to something like the ML Acades, the Light Acades, which kind of effectively does his job now, or something similar to his job. However, the buff that they've given to him is now he dispels 2 buffs with his skill 2, which is obviously really big. But in addition to this, you also are granted an extra turn if you soul burn with him. Now, to add to this, and the reason why the extra turn is so significant is because they're buffing his skill 3, where now when you defeat an enemy, you extend the debuff duration of all sorry, let me repeat. You extend the debuff durations of all remaining enemies by 1 turn. Now that means that presumably in this case, if you have any debuffs, whether that's stun, sleep, defense break, silence, whatever it is, these all get extended by 1 turn if you kill someone on their team, barring of course something like, I guess, immunity. Now, while that by itself is already a pretty significant change, I think the biggest thing here, however, is that now they've also increased, or they're now allowing him to scale or deal a bit more damage with this skill 3 ability. And aside from the increase in damage, presumably, that you now just deal for having max HP or having high health, they're now also increasing the damage of the ability if the target is inflicted with sleep. Now, to be clear, formerly or prior to this, if I'm not mistaken, you weren't able to activate a critical hit or a heavy blow, which I think, you know, if people were trying to sleep and fish for something like a crit, as again, you're guaranteed to crit on anyone that is sleeping, that wasn't able to be the case. But with this is effectively just a direct buff to the damage of the skill 3, and alongside the other effects, it seems insane. Now, again, whether or not this is going to be a character that you pick up or that you use instead of Light Katie's, tough to say right now, but still worthwhile and worth talking about, honestly. Now, the next thing that they buffed, and arguably the craziest change, not in terms of what it actually does, but just the fact that they're buffing her, is the Conqueror Lilius buff. This character, if you guys hadn't seen her for like the past 3 or 4 years, that makes sense, but in her heyday and for I guess the good part of the first 2 or so years of her introduction into the game was a staple. She was absolutely ridiculous. The vigor, the attack down, the extra turn, the redirect provoke, the pushback, all of this was absolutely ridiculous back in the day. However, with new openers like Sea Phantom Politis, with characters like New Moon Luna, Emma Lua, the Helion Lua, all these characters are absolutely ridiculous in terms of the opener category, and with that they've given some love to the Conqueror Lilius now, and with that she now increases the combat readiness push of all, or the combat readiness rather, of all allies by 15% with her skill 3. And in addition to this, she now, instead of pushing back by 25%, which by the way I'm not sure or super sure how great this will be. I feel like a lot of people actually prefer the pushback, but in any case, you're now able to actually defense break one specific target with her S2. Now, to add to this, you are able now to soul burn this effect in order to extend the duration of any debuffs that you apply by the skill by 1 turn. And of course, this is supposed to incentivize or prevent you from, you know, soul burning or just using your skill 2 and then the defense rate just falls off, because obviously you're not pushing them back. Now, overall, I think this is an absolutely ridiculous change. I think Conqueror Lilius still has pretty good use, honestly, in content like Guild War and stuff, when you find the need or when you find yourself not fighting against super insane targets. And in addition to this, there are characters that are now seeming to scale or do well with Vigor specifically. The defense break also helps, and honestly, the combat readiness push is nothing really to scoff at. But as we'll see later with Inferno Kawazu, I actually think that this buff is super big, especially for that character. Now, moving along though, we have Lionheart Seria, and I know I've already kind of mentioned that some of the earlier characters seem like the winners of the patch, but this is also kind of a winner of the patch. Overall, just as a bit of a spoiler, apologies if you haven't made it all the way through the video, but this is kind of a big patch, and honestly, it's got a lot of hope and a lot of promise to it. Now, for Lionheart Seria though, this change is now allowing her to give herself not only defense buff when you activate her skill 2, she also gives herself immunity for 3 turns, which is honestly what she needed to begin with. And this whole effect resistance 50-50ing thing, where people would build like a little bit of effect resistance to pray that they didn't get one shot, yeah, that was kind of cope, honestly. Yes, of course, you could spread a little bit of effect resistance into your kit or into her kit and into her kit so that she doesn't get one shot, but ultimately taking that 50-50, getting stripped by an arrow wall, or, you know, getting hit by some random debuff is kind of ridiculous. Now, again, to be clear, you are still at the mercy of strips in this game, so again, arrow wall still can kind of deal with or punish the Lionheart Seria, but she's not super viable anymore, so who cares? That said though, the immunity I think will be nice in cases where you are fighting against most of the counterattack, dual attack, or extra attack characters in the game. Someone like the Landy will not be as effective for trying to stun you if you're in that sort of position. Characters that stray, I guess, provoke or debuff you, like the Solitarias and stuff, if you aren't S3'd first, will now suffer a little bit more as well. And just overall, I think more than anything else, this 30% increase to the combat readiness push to now be 50% does make her a super lethal threat. Honestly, I can imagine this getting buffed in the future to go from 50 to 100%. Spoiler, by the way, for what Commander Pavel's about to be. But just in general, I think the additional stats, the additional speed, and well, stats, rather, the additional effect in addition to the extra ready or combat readiness push is huge for her. This is going to definitely change, or definitely going to help those that are trying to play a cleave Lionheart Seria to counter people that tried to play super slow and with counter units in general. I personally have been, or used to run like a 230 to 240 Lionheart Seria just so I could take someone like Ran into like a counter team. They see the Lionheart Seria and they don't ban it or whatever because they don't think it's fast enough to cut, and then I one-shot them. That's what I personally think this will probably be the most effective for when it comes to Lionheart Seria. But ultimately, if she ends up being a strong slow character as well, I could see that as well, just because again 50% combat readiness push is nothing to scoff at. Next, we have Commander Pavel. Commander Pavel is receiving a decent buff. I don't know for sure how good this really will be. Now, of course, the combat readiness push increasing to 100%, massive. And even if you decide that you are going to, for instance, play against a character like the Politis or the Abyssal Euphine, well, guess what? 50% combat readiness push is a pretty significant amount. And even if you're cut in half, it's not enough to really deter someone like Commander Pavel from now taking the turn. Now, what I'm I would say most interested in when it comes to this skill, however, is how much you'll actually gain in terms of the damage here, as you do get the damage dealt increase from both the skill 2 and the skill 3. That's also in addition to the soul burn, but we'll have to see. Ultimately, though, I think that the Commander Pavel is a little bit difficult to play at the moment, just because although Litica is strong, there's now people that are playing openers like Renak. Some players, I would say, are now playing more a mid. And just in general, having a crit opener like Ran is less popular than some of the others. And ultimately, again, you are always at the mercy of a character like Sea Phantom Politis or other characters that reduce or prevent you from having stacks. Or rather, Fighting Spirit. Apologies. Now next, we have the 1 quintillionth buff to Twisted Eidolon Kron. He might actually be up there with Melissa at this point, which is really comical because they did just love to buff that character 1,000 times in a row. Effectively, though, now they're basically making his conditions and his effectiveness, or I guess his requirements, lessened. Now, to start things off, his skill 1 now applies injury, which again, they tried selling people on the injury in like the showcase and stuff so that he could be played in slower team compositions, which I respect. But building injury set on Kron is absolutely coping, honestly. You just don't have enough stat to do what you want to do, and with that, I understand that. I understand why they rather added that into his kit. Now, in addition to this, what I think is also funny is that they've also given him so much in terms of value and stats to his kit that this character has to be good, or has to be good surely with this buff. Now what they're doing is that when he gets the 100%, or rather when he has full Fighting Spirit, he now fully dispels all debuffs from himself and then also increases the combat readiness by 100%. That's ridiculous, honestly. That's basically Senya's, or young Senya's passive, but now on Kron. And he also injures with his skill 1. Now, that alone, okay, you can argue is a bit cope. You know, getting to the Fighting Spirit is a little bit difficult. And again, there are characters that stop this. But then you read his skill 3, and one of the things that kind of struggled or kind of made Kron struggle in the past is that some of the more popular characters at the time, you had like the Aidens, you have the Flans. Some of these characters were kind of just Kron killers. Like Afternoon Soak Flan does not care whatsoever about the Kron, really. She can't be countered with her skill 1, and in some cases, if you're just lucky enough and you get enough duels, her S1 could just kill a Kron, depending on what your build is. However, now because his skill 3 deals the massive additional damage regardless if the attack hits, and in addition to this, now because she also, or rather he also gains a 30% general damage reduction buff instead of just crit, it makes him much tankier, especially if you're trying to counter someone like Kron with the Last Rider Crow. Though again, I still think that someone like Last Rider Crow is probably going to beat up Twisted Eidolon Kron. That's kind of a bad matchup for him. Now, the next character we have is Top Model Lula, and this is the last of the ML5s. Now, Top Model Lula's buffs are honestly kind of mid. Admittedly, again, this first one I didn't quite understand at first. The skill 1 is now being buffed so that now this can effectively activate even if it's not on her turn, and that's it. That's okay, I guess, like, you know, and even in what they describe this to be, this is supposed to be an S1 buff so that you could make it more effective in situations like with duels for allies, which is like, like, okay, well, like, what are we even talking about, right? Like, is someone using Sea Phantom Politis and top model, like, you know what I mean? Like, those aren't even really like combinations or characters you'd see together. Whatever the case, though, obviously we'll take any buffs to top model that we can get. The skill 1 buff, okay. The skill 3 buff, however, is a bit more impactful, as now you penetrate the defense of the enemy by 50%. This is a pretty big one. 50% defense, or 50% defense pen on skill 3, so long as your speed is twice that of the target, is pretty significant. Again, now there are characters that are usually, in most cases, like a bit more difficult to deal with, or I guess are more anti-cleave oriented, and I think this is specifically designed to one-shot or deal with characters like that. However, I have to be honest, a lot of the characters that are in this sort of situation, or that you'd be using your skill 3 on, are kind of not going to die anyways. Like, you have the you have characters like the Amikis nowadays, you have the Bloodblade Karens, you have the Senias. A lot of these characters truthfully just aren't going to die, even with the target, or rather the penetration buff to the skill 3, and that's not because she doesn't do enough damage or top model doesn't do enough damage. It's just because they have some sort of gimmick to prevent themselves from dying, and in most cases that's around, especially nowadays, like what you'll actually see when people try to anti-cleave. This could be decent, I guess, if you're just trying to use her as a general opener and you try to perhaps one-shot someone like the, I don't know, like the Empyrean Ilinov. Well, actually not even that character, I guess, because obviously it's the pen defense is reduced, but any tank character, I guess, in general, maybe like the Arunka is supposed to be one of the goals or the aims of killing, or the aims of this skill 3. However, I just can't imagine, and just from raw testing, I cannot imagine that the skill, even with the buff, does enough to actually one-shot or reduce the effectiveness of characters like Arunka. So whether or not this top model buff is enough, you know, we'll have to see. Ultimately, a lot of these numbers and all this damage tuning and explaining, or, you know, prediction, really just comes down to when we see the actual multipliers. Now, okay, next we have Festive Ida, and honestly, this Festive Ida buff is a lot. Effectively, what they've done to her is she's now basically just like a stun defense breaker, but she does it in like a different order. So to start things off, her S1 now stuns instead of blinds. Okay, honestly, like, it is what it is. I think the chance to blind was also kind of annoying, and honestly, a 40% chance to stun for 1 turn is kind of like whatever. However, with the change to her S2, now she reduces the combat readiness push of the enemy by 50%, but is now, I guess, also being geared to deal damage. Now, to be clear, they didn't get rid of the defense break and the combat readiness push necessarily, and obviously the combat readiness pushback is still here, but instead what they've done is they've actually changed her skill 3 now to not have the unbuffable, but instead have the defense break alongside the silence. And so again, this is quite a powerful skill 3. It's an ignore ER soulburn passive. However, again, you do need to strip, or you do have to be aware of the fact that this is only a 2-turn buff strip, and some characters or some variations of this, or variations of characters nowadays, will have several buffs depending on if you have immunity and protection set, which is something that you'll have to take into consideration. But otherwise, this is kind of impactful. Now again, for Festive Ida's current use, most people are using her as like an anti-AoE kind of character, similar to that of a Holiday Euphine, but realistically, there are just better options or better ways to deal with characters that are trying to AoE you. And even with someone like Holiday Euphine, who I would honestly say is probably the best at dealing with the anti-AoEing, she kind of does it better than Festive Ida does, and I'm not sure if this change to Festive Ida will necessarily make her good enough to deal with that, though of course there are people that will swear by the character. And obviously, maybe with the defense break and the changes to her kit where she now kind of deals damage, she'll be used for a different role. Who can say? Now, the other change that they've actually added to the Covenant characters, or another 5-star Covenant character, is Flan. Flan's S1 now just by default just defense breaks, which is okay, honestly. obviously I get the idea behind this, and it's nice if you're, say, going to use the double flan composition, use like blue flan with fire flan. However, actually, I think that the change from having a dispel to not having a dispel is actually quite, I'd actually say suspect in some cases. But overall, I would say that although flan in the past was maybe used to try and strip someone like the Bloodblade Karen or the Amiki's like immortality, this is definitely not a character that really does that anymore, and rather she's not picked at all, in fact. With this, maybe this makes her a bit better if you're trying to use her as a again, an enabler for the other flan, but her skill 3 is quite interesting, with it now actually increasing the skill cooldown of all enemies by 1 turn in place of the unhealable. Now, again, similar to, and I have to just say, similar to that of the skill 1 here, where it no longer strips. This is another change that, though I understand the value of it, like, you know, this skill cooldown reduction, there is some value to inflicting unhealable on enemies. Like, sometimes you don't want the Bloodblade Karen or the Amiki or some other character, well, not the Amiki, but you don't want the Bloodblade Karen, or you don't want some anti-healing character to start healing, or some healing based character to heal again, and therefore the anti-heal is quite impactful. But overall, if this is enough to actually make the character viable or good again from before, that's fine, because otherwise, honestly, flan not the popular of a character, and most people would rather use someone like Briarwitch as Seria, or just not defense break at all. Now, to add to this, they've obviously changed like the EE that gave you the 100% chance to dispel a buff, and now it's an 85% chance to inflict the defense break. Overall though, I don't see this to be super insane. I think people that were going to use flan before were already going to use her, and otherwise, well, congratulations, you have a reset, I suppose. I guess it's still pretty significant though. I would probably say this is the biggest change for her. Okay, now moving along, we have Summer Break Charlotte. This is another character who, again, in most cleave characters, when they touch cleave characters or they buff cleave characters, it's very, they're very touchy with it, or they're very fragile and delicate with the way that they touch some of the buffs to cleave characters, as they're very afraid, I think, of breaking the game into having a character that one-shots everything. With this, however, they're now changing her or buffing her kit, so now that she has a 75% chance to defense break for 1 turn. To add to this, they've also increased the combat readiness that you gain they've changed the combat readiness push from giving it to herself and giving herself 25% combat readiness push after using her skill 2 to now giving team-wide combat readiness push to 20% for all allies on her team. So effectively, rather than being more selfish and being able to use her skill 2 where she AoEs and then she herself takes the turn, rather now the entire team gets pushed up. And again, this is a most positive buff for the cleave Summer Break Charlotte players. However, overall, again, I'm not sure if this is necessarily enough to make her super insane, as again, most of the time, if you were going to take someone like Summer Break Charlotte, you'd probably take her into someone like the Savior Aiden, but that character is definitely not as popular as she formerly was. Now, they've also buffed her damage, so we'll have to see if that's significant enough. However, my gut feeling is that they don't really buff damage numbers super high when they do changes like this, unless if they state otherwise. So this will probably be, or I would imagine this is probably an okay buff, but not insane. Now, they've also buffed some of the other characters. Now, admittedly, the changes to Lilit, Mui, and Shirun are pretty mediocre. They're okay. Now, you'll see what they're going to do to the character, and don't get me wrong, these are some of the changes that I think a lot of people have asked or suggested for a while. However, just in the state of maybe just RTA right now, and it could just be that characters like Arunka and Holiday Yuffie and Renak are so overbearing, but when you read some of the kits of these characters, though they are extremely cool, like as we'll get into with Lilit, I just cannot imagine a world where, unless if their numbers are tuned out the wazoo, where like you'd actually be able to kill or be effective against some of the most popular characters right now. Let's start with the Lilit though. So first and foremost, the Lilit's S1 now gives her combat readiness push when you deal it. In addition to this, with her skill 2, she now has a 100% chance to dispel all buffs, a soul burn that allows you to ignore this ER, and in addition to this, if you crit with her skill 2, you now are granted an extra turn. So again, this is something that was definitely thought about and considered for a long time, as a lot of people considered this like bleeding effect mechanic they had to get more extra like combat readiness push. Like this was a very outdated system and something that they've definitely done in the past, but most of the characters that have mechanics like this are just getting changed out of this system or out of this formula, or they're just being removed entirely in terms of the mechanic. Now again, do I think that this is cool, like this dispel all buffs and the crit? Sure. Do I think that you could just end up fighting against a Navy Captain Landy, or do I think that you may just end up fighting against a Runka and you don't do enough damage with your skill 2 into skill 3? That's also pretty true. Now, the only, or rather the major if here to this is that her skill 3 has been buffed rather to now penetrate the target's defense, and this could be super significant. Penetrating defense is huge, honestly. However, she is a grass unit, and a lot of fire units are pretty powerful. You definitely have to deal with characters, again, like the Afternoon Soak Flan. You have to deal with characters like Janua and stuff, which can make this feel a little bit more iffy. However, if you are able to get through some of the tanks, such as the Fallen Cecilia, the Abyssal Yufine, or even the again, the Runkas of the world, then maybe Lilibit has more of a fighting chance. But this change to Lilibit seems more like a cleave anchor sort of answer. And I suppose if someone ends up taking someone like a Karina or a water unit in general, you may find super value with Lilibit. However, although there is a hit chance increase, although there is a skill nullifier, although there is an extinction, and although she fully defense pens, this might still not be enough, just because of the way that, again, the characters in the game currently exist. This penetrate target defense thing looks amazing until Empyrean Ilanov is one of the most picked characters in the game. Now, again, I could be proven wrong. Some people may choose to pick the or steal the Ilanov away. You may pick this as a 5th pick, and you might find some value from that in terms of or in terms of Lilibit. But otherwise, I think it's a great change, maybe if you're doing something like Arena or Guild War, but I don't suspect this will change anything for RTA. Now, Mui is effectively getting minor changes. Her skill 1 now has a 100% chance to target an enemy, but they're reducing the turn duration to 1 instead of 2, which is honestly kind of fair. To add to this, they're now increasing the amount of combat readiness push that she got formerly from 25 per crit to now 30. I suppose this is supposed to, I guess, help in case you end up in a situation where there's like an evasion character like a Flan, or you may end up fighting against something like a Savior Aiden, or you may end up I don't know what it is, the case based, or what the case could be exactly, but like maybe there's just a case where you don't end up critting, and in that case, getting 90% push instead of 75 if you end up hitting 3 targets instead of 4 could be kind of nice. But ultimately, this change is very unusual, as it, again, it helps, but it doesn't quite seem as impactful or as crazy as some of the other changes right above. Now, on the topic of crits though, we will get to it later, as I do think there maybe is some pairing that they're trying to lean up or kind of build with the crit buffing from Mui. But before we get to that, we have to talk about Shirun. Shirun is effectively getting a bunch of quality of life to her kit. Her S1 now has a 100% chance to inflict venom as opposed to before. Her soul burn is now ignore ER, which is also pretty nice, especially as, again, you'll want to guarantee the skill cooldown reset in most cases if you're playing her. But to add to this, they're also increasing the combat readiness push that you gain of the caster by 5%. To add to this, rather than give yourself a random buff and a barrier, now what they're doing is they've removed this random buff, and in place of it, the ally with the highest attack, where they formerly would receive a random buff, they now increase their combat readiness push by 25% as well. Again, could be pretty significant, could be really helpful or nice for turn cycling. However, this is a character that, for all intents and purposes, is basically outskilled, outplayed, outperformed by Death Dealer Ray, unfortunately, or by some other opener or debuffer, which makes it a little bit difficult at times to play the Shirun. But these changes are pretty cool. They just might not be enough for what we're seeing currently. Now, despite this, I do want to also say that the slow debuff that she applies on her skill 3, in addition to now applying 2 venoms as opposed to 1, could help in terms of applying many debuffs. But again, as I'm sure you guys could tell, Venom is not in super high demand right now, and unlike some other characters that may have some other mechanics to hold your team over, a slow debuff, a one or a single target skill cooldown increase, these are just not necessarily enough, I would say, to make her go super crazy. Though I am pretty interested in terms of the combat readiness push that you now get from the skill 2. That could be pretty cool, honestly. Now, for the Moonlights, Seria is getting buffed. And with this, first and foremost, they're giving the combat readiness push EE just base into her kit. So now it's 25%, which again is pretty cool. However, it is worth mentioning that now they're changing her EE to now give attack buff to all allies for 3 turns when using her skill 3. Not much to say here either. This is kind of a long time coming. It's honestly pretty nice that they're giving attack buff to all allies. I think at the moment she already gives crit chance buff. Honestly, I was kind of expecting at some point her EE to give her greater attack buff, but I'll take this. However, again, I don't know if this is necessarily going to be enough to bring her back into viability, as again, there are so many other characters that bridge or do her job but better. Now, next we have Inferno Kawazu, and with Inferno Kawazu, his change is significant. They're now changing the burn effect from Kawazu's skill 3 to now actually allow you to... Actually, I apologize. I think... I think this is his skill 1. Okay, I'll have to fact check this later. Either his skill 1 or his skill 3 is now ignoring effect resistance. Presumably this is the skill 3. I would assume this is a skill 3 since this is the effect 3 and the EE. Presumably, if this is the skill 3, this is huge, obviously, because now you can have a more effective way to ignore ER with your damage or with your burns in general. However, this added extra burn is also pretty impactful. And otherwise, honestly, this silence that she had previously was kind of cope, or that he had previously rather was kind of cope. I'm not really sure what the direction with this was, honestly. And this is just what he should have had to begin with. Now, ultimately, again, I do think that the vigor buff, or the vigor buffing and the crit buffing, or the crit synergy and the vigor synergy that we've seen through the patch is quite noticeable. I do want to say, though, that in terms of impact and in terms of interest, the changes that they've made in this balance patch are very respectable. They look cool. They do change characters in meaningful ways, and I'm honestly interested in seeing how people play out the new E7 World Championship mode alongside these new characters, as... Again, if I'm not mistaken, although this might not be the, although I don't think this will probably be usable for like the qualifier or the main stage, this might be able to be used for the top 8, maybe, perhaps. Otherwise, regardless, I think that, again, still being able to see all these changes to characters is super sick. 15 characters being changed, with 13 being super definitely relevant characters, though I would definitely argue that ML Kawazu and Seria may seem some viability after this. But in general, 13 to 15 characters being changed is huge, amazing. Good job, Smilegate. You kind of cooked. I think the changes are cool, though. Again, we'll have to see numbers and performance before we actually say how good or how bad they are. Thanks again for watching, though, everyone. Hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.